Ashford Grand Hotel rose above downtown Nashville like a building that had decided long ago what it was and had never reconsidered. 40 feet of marble lobby, 4 floors of gilded corridor, grand ballroom on the second floor that cost more per hour to rent than most people earned in a month. Tonight, 200 guests were inside it. They had no idea. Neither did the 6-man security team. Neither did the woman at the podium, the one who had spent 3 years building toward this moment. Only one person in the building knew what was actually in the room. He was pushing a mop. He had been watching for 6 hours, reporting for 3, turned away every time. And now the man he had been watching all day had stopped checking his pocket. His hand wasn't moving anymore. It was waiting on the stage. The microphone clicked on. The lights went up, and somewhere in the back of the room, a janitor set down his mop. Ashford Grand Hotel rose above downtown Nashville like a building that had decided long ago what it was and had never reconsidered. 40 feet of marble lobby, 4 floors of gilded corridor, a grand ballroom on the second floor that cost more per hour to rent than most people earned in a month. The kind of place that made people straighten their posture just by walking through the front door. Ois had stopped straightening his posture here about 18 months ago. 5 in the morning, the second floor corridor, that particular silence that only exists in large buildings before the people inside them wake up and remember they need things. Jeffrey moved the mop in slow, even strokes across the marble, working from the east wall toward the service alcove. Always did, the way the marble required, with the grain, not against it. The building had its logic. He had learned to follow it. The corridor lights ran at 40% this early, hotel policy. Saved on the electric bill, plus the maintenance crew didn't need full brightness to do their work. Jeffrey had stopped noticing the dimness after the first week. You adjusted. That was what people did when they stayed somewhere long enough. They adjusted, then they stopped thinking about adjusting, and then the place became simply where they were. He paused at the end of a stroke and listened. Somewhere on the floor above, a room service cart was moving. A specific rattle of a warming tray cover not fully latched. 3rd floor, east wing, it's me, the corner suite. Probably the corner suite. The one with the kitchen access that the regular overnight about twice this month, because the cart's storage space was 2 inches too narrow, and they always clipped the wall bracket on the way out. But Jeffrey had flagged it in the maintenance log. Nobody had fixed it yet. He made a mental note to flag it again. That was the job. You notice things. You logged them. You came back the next day and noticed them again if they hadn't been addressed. There's no drama in it. No urgency. The building needed attention the way any large system needed attention. Consistently, without sentiment, without expecting it to thank you. He moved the cart forward 6 feet and started the next part. Years ago, he would not have been able to explain why this suited him. He would not have had the language for it, or the distance. 3 years ago, he had still been the kind of man who filled a room differently. Not loudly, had never been loud, but with a specific weight. The kind of weight that came from knowing exactly what you were capable of and being paid to make sure other people never had to find out. DJ contractor, protection detail. The Marlowe program, which was not something that appeared in any biblical record or government website, because the work it trained people for was not the kind of work that benefited from documentation. You learned how to read a room in 3 seconds, like how to identify threat patterns before they became threats, how to move through a crowd without registering, not disappearing exactly, more like becoming the background, the thing everyone's eyes slid past because there was nothing to snag on. Jeffrey had been very good at that part. The other parts he had been good at too. Until the night in Cincinnati when he wasn't. He didn't think about Cincinnati often. Not suppression, just that he had spent a long time learning to put things in their correct locations. And Cincinnati had its location. A specific weight, a specific shape. O. Paulson. A woman named the witness list for a federal contractor fraud case and who had been standing in the wrong place at the wrong moment because Jeffrey had read a secondary exit as low probability when the data had been suggesting medium probability for the previous 40 minutes. Had overridden his own instinct because the team lead was confident and Jeffrey had deferred when he should not have deferred. Paulson had been hit in the shoulder. She survived. She recovered. She testified. But Jeffrey submitted his resignation the following morning. Nobody asked him to. Nobody told him he needed to. The review board found the incident within acceptable operational parameters, which was the kind of sentence that meant something different to the person who wrote it than to the person who had been standing in that corridor watching the thing unfold in the fraction of a second before he could stop it. Packed his apartment in Cincinnati in 4 hours. Drove south without a specific destination. Stopped in Nashville because the city was large enough to be anonymous and small enough to feel like a place where a person could actually live, not just operate. Found the listing for the Ashford Grand Maintenance position in a local employment posting. Applied with just enough general detail to satisfy the screening process. 2 years later. 5th floor to 2nd floor, paying to West Wing. The Ashford Grand's corridors had become as familiar to him as any environment he had ever worked in. More familiar, maybe. Because he was not working them tactically, he was just working them. Finished the corridor pass, wrung out the mop and checked his watch, 5:47. He had the linen room restock before 6. Then the 2nd floor fitness center before the early guests started using it around 6:30. Aimed the 3rd floor service corridor that the cart storage issue had been marking up. After that, the day would open up into whatever it needed to be. There was always something. The building was always asking for something. He didn't mind. I pushed the cart toward the service alcove and heard the elevator at the far end of the corridor open. Laura Clark, the hotel manager, Ether, stepped out with the particular expression of someone who had already been dealing with something before most people had finished their first cup of coffee. Laura was 50, organized in the way that people became organized when they had been managing large systems for a long time, and she moved through the Ashford Grand with the proprietary awareness of someone who knew every corner of it personally. Noticed Jeffrey and slowed. Early start, 3rd floor bracket still hasn't been fixed. Jeffrey kept moving the cart. Flagged it again this morning. I saw the note. Laura fell into step with him briefly, glancing at her clipboard. Elson Infrastructure arrives at 9. Full motorcade. Grand ballroom locked for pre-event setup from 10 onward. Security sweep starting at 8. Private contractor team, 6 personnel, plus the principal's details. She paused. I need the 2nd floor brass done before they start the sweep. I'll be finished by 7:30. Good. She was already looking at the clipboard again. Big event, Jeffrey. Wilson's launching something significant. Infrastructure project, money involved, press list is substantial. Everyone's going to be very particular about everything today. They usually are. She almost smiled at that. Try to stay out of the way of the security sweep. Always do. Waved toward the stairwell and Jeffrey turned toward the supply alcove. He had a job to do. The brass fixtures on the 2nd floor had 17 individual pieces. Each one took approximately 4 minutes to properly clean and polish. He had until 7:30. He pulled out the polish and started counting. Motorcade arrived at 9:14, not 9, which was what the schedule had said. 14 minutes late. Jeffrey noted this without particular significance as he restocked the 2nd floor linen cart near the elevator bank. 3 black SUVs, a vehicle parked at an angle that created a natural buffer between the hotel entrance and the street. Not a coincidence, not a parking preference, a positioning decision, made by someone who had thought about sight lines and approach vectors before the vehicle doors opened. The man who stepped out of the lead SUV first was Timothy Clark. Jeffrey recognized the movement before he recognized the face. Timothy's eyes went across the entrance portico in a specific 3-point pattern, left anchor, right anchor, center depth, before his body fully committed to exiting the vehicle. A small thing. A kind of small thing that most people would not notice and would not know to look for, even if they did notice it. But Jeffrey had spent several years learning to read exactly that kind of small thing. In Timothy Clark's movement in the first 4 seconds was trained, experienced, currently working a principle he takes seriously. Timothy was 48, probably. The compact build of someone who had trained for function over a long period of time. No wasted motion. When he swept the entrance, his hands stayed loose at his sides. That was correct. Hands that were tight or positioned told people something was coming. Hands that were loose told people nothing. He had learned that, or he had been taught it. A step to the side of the vehicle door and Margaret Wilson got out. Jeffrey had seen photographs of Margaret Wilson in the news coverage running for the past 2 weeks about the Wilson Infrastructure Group's federal project announcement. Photographs had not conveyed the room-altering quality of her actual presence. She was 52, dressed in a structured dark suit that communicated executive authority without effort. It walked from the vehicle to the entrance with the particular confidence that did not need to assert itself because it had already decided the matter. She did not look at the entrance as a threshold to be navigated, looked at it as a place she was arriving at, which was a different relationship entirely. A woman stepped out behind her, Sandra Anderson. According to the hotel's advanced coordination documents that Laura had seed the maintenance team on, at 40, tablet already in hand, 2 steps behind Margaret and slightly to her left. After Sandra came 2 more security personnel, then a logistics coordinator Jeffrey didn't have a name for, and the motorcade had completed its business. Timothy Clark held the entrance door. Margaret Wilson walked through without looking at him. Jeffrey pushed the linen cart to the next alcove and went back to work. The grand ballroom was on the 2nd floor, which was architecturally unusual for a building the Ashford Grand size, a deliberate choice by the original designers. The 2nd floor gave the ballroom access to the building's central atrium lighting, while keeping the event space isolated from the street-level noise that plagued ground-floor venues in Nashville's downtown corridor. The result was a room that felt elevated in every sense. High ceilings, controlled natural light during the day, precision artificial lighting for evening events, a kind of room that cost a significant amount per hour to rent and communicated that fact through every surface. Jeffrey had polished those surfaces. Many times, he was assigned to the ballroom for the Wilson pre-event setup, a standard protocol for events of this scale. The maintenance team provided 2 people for surface work during setup, whoever was doing the brass fixtures and floor maintenance as the caterers and technical crew moved through the space. Jeffrey worked the eastern wall, keeping clear of the staging area where the technical crew was running cable and testing the podium lighting. The room filled gradually with the controlled chaos of large event preparation, caterers moving in sections, a lighting technician on a ladder arguing quietly with someone on a headset about the angle of a key spot, a florist arranging centerpieces with the focused irritations of someone who had been told to be finished by noon and was not going to be finished by noon. Jeffrey worked through all of it. He was finishing the 3rd brass fixture on the eastern wall when the ballroom doors opened and Margaret Wilson walked in. Not the same Margaret Wilson he had seen arriving at the hotel. That version had been arriving. This version was assessing. There was a quality of attention in her eyes as she stepped into the room that was different from simply looking. She was running a calculation, moving her gaze across the space in a systematic pattern, measuring, adjusting. As someone looks at a problem they have spent 3 years building toward and are now finally in the room with. Timothy Clark positioned himself near the main entrance, scanning from habit. Sandra Anderson, 2 steps behind Margaret, opened her tablet. 3 of Margaret's executives followed her in, passings, spreading into the loose formation of people who had attended many walkthroughs with Margaret Wilson and had learned where not to stand and where to position themselves to hear her comments without appearing to crowd her. Jeffrey continued with the brass fixture. He did not look at any of them directly. He was a piece of the room's furniture as far as they were concerned, and he intended to stay that way. Of halfway through the 4th fixture when he saw Gary Young Eastern Corridor entrance, partially visible behind a service cart loaded with water glasses. White server's jacket. Nothing unusual about any of those details individually. About them together was wrong. Jeffrey did not stop polishing. But something in him that had been quiet for 2 years shifted into a different register. The man behind the cart, Gary Young, though Jeffrey didn't know his name yet, was standing too still. Not the stillness of someone waiting to be assigned a task. Not the idle stillness of someone whose mind was elsewhere. A specific stillness of someone whose mind was very precisely present and focused on something across the room. Jeffrey had been in rooms with that quality of attention before. Not often, but enough. Act Gary's eye line without moving his own head. The man looked at the stage, then at the side access to the stage on the left, then at the main floor in front of the podium, then back to the stage. 3 looks in 90 seconds at the same target cluster. Not idle, not decorative. A specific kind of looking that Jeffrey recognized the way you recognize a word in a language you used to speak fluently and have not spoken in years. He kept polishing. Right, and then Margaret Wilson stopped mid-sentence. The room shifted, not loudly. The particular way rooms shift when a person with authority suddenly redirects their attention, like a temperature change, like the barometric drop before weather arrives. Jeffrey registered it before he consciously understood what had caused it. He was on the wrong side of the stanchion rope, a thin, corded barrier set up around the VIP section, a standard protocol for secured event walkthroughs. He had not noticed it when he moved to reach the fixture from this angle. The fixture needed to be done from this side to do it correctly. The rope was a formality, standing on the wrong side of it, and Margaret Wilson had noticed. Her voice carried across the room without effort. That was the thing about voices that had given commands for a long time. They didn't need volume, like doing on this side of the rope. Jeffrey looked at her, finishing the fixtures. "I'll be out of your way in 2 minutes," he said it calmly, factually, because it was true. This appeared to be the wrong answer. Like something tightened in Margaret's expression. Not anger exactly. More like the specific irritation of a person who has been given a correct answer to a question they intended as a rebuke. Walked 3 deliberate steps toward him. Not the absent drift of someone who continues moving while talking, but 3 steps that established this as a conversation she had chosen to have. This section is for event personnel, enunciated each word with careful precision. Do you understand what that means? I do. Then you understand that a maintenance worker does not belong inside a secured perimeter during a pre-event walkthrough. Jeffrey said nothing to that. Ison stretched. In his peripheral vision, he could see 2 of the executives shift their weight. He could see Sandra's stylus pause over the tablet. He could see Timothy Clark near the entrance, not looking at this exchange. It was itself a form of looking away. Margaret took the silence as confirmation. Security decisions, event logistics, perimeter management. These are not things that fall within your role here. She was not speaking only to him now, addressing the room, or some version of the room that she needed to address in this moment. People in your position are here to keep the facility running. That is the extent of it, but the decisions that keep an event like this safe are made by qualified professionals, not by someone who maintains the floors. One of the executives made a sound that might have been amusement and then reconsidered, looked at her for a moment. He thought about 6 things simultaneously, and the 6th thing was Gary Young, who was still standing near the eastern corridor, still not moving, still watching the stage with that particular focused quality that Jeffrey had spent his career learning to recognize. 6th thing was also the most important thing, but it was not the thing that could be said right now. In this room, response to this conversation, he finished the fixture. Stepped back over the rope, walked toward the service corridor. He didn't look at Margaret Wilson on his way out. Not because he was angry, not because he was ashamed, because there was nothing useful to say to her right now, and there was something more important than any of this happening 30 feet away near the eastern wall. He heard her say something to Sandra about proper staff protocols. Heard the room exhale and return to its business. He turned left at the service corridor entrance instead of right, because right went to the supply room and left went around the perimeter of the ballroom. Service corridors of the Ashford Grand ran behind the main event spaces in a functional loop, wide enough for 2 carts to pass, lit with the utilitarian brightness of spaces that existed to be used rather than admired. Access panels every 30 feet for the building's electrical and HVAC systems. Jeffrey had moved through them hundreds of times. He knew every access point, every junction, a spot where the sight line through a service panel gap gave a partial view into the main ballroom. He moved slowly, methodically, collecting used linens from the prep area access points, replacing supply stock in the wall niches, a specific unremarkable work of a maintenance employee during a busy event setup, and every 40 feet, without stopping or changing his pace, he checked where Gary Young was. 15 minutes in, Gary had moved. Not far. As now nearer the stage access on the western side, pushing the service cart with the water glasses, walking like someone who had been told to move the cart. But the glasses were still full. Nothing had been poured, nothing had been served, like the cart had traveled from its position near the eastern corridor to the western side of the stage access. Approximately 60 feet, and in that 60 feet, every glass on the cart had remained where it started. Jeffrey filed this. First observation confirmed. Not a snapshot. The beginning of a sequence 19 minutes in. Gary stopped again. New position, facing the stage. His left hand rested on the cart handle, but his fingers weren't gripping it. They were resting. The difference was visible if you had learned to look for it. A hand that grips is attached to a task. A hand that rests is attached to something else entirely. And then Gary's right hand moved to his left jacket pocket. Brief. 2 seconds, fingers pressing lightly against the fabric, confirming something, the shape of something, the presence of something, and then withdrawing. Not a phone. The shape was wrong for a phone. People who check phones do it with a specific anticipatory motion, eyes going down. Gary's eyes did not move. He checked the pocket the way you check a load-bearing seam, not to read it, just to confirm it was still there. Jeffrey had seen that gesture in rooms very different from this one. He thought he needed at least 5 data points before going to anyone with something concrete enough to be taken seriously. 1 data point was an observation. That pattern. 5 was a conclusion he could defend. He checked his watch. 2:43 in the afternoon. He went back to work and started counting. By 2:58, 15 minutes after the first pocket check, Gary moved again. Cart, new angle. He positioned himself at the northern edge of the ballroom's prep section, which gave him a partial view of the podium's right side. His hand went to the pocket a second time. 2 seconds, same press, same withdrawal. Confirmed checks. 2 positions, both with stage visibility. Jeffrey noted the time and kept moving. At 3:19, Gary settled near the base of the stage's eastern access ramp. The water glasses on the cart were still untouched. They'd been in the room for over an hour. No supervisor had approached him. No catering staff had engaged him in any task-related conversation. With the practiced stillness of someone who had rehearsed standing still in exactly this kind of space. His right hand went to the left jacket pocket. 3rd check, 2 seconds. Eyes on the room rather than down. 3 data points. A pattern. At 3:41, Gary drifted to the center of the ballroom's eastern wall, positioning himself between 2 prep tables in a shadow created by the gap between a floor lamp and a column. From that spot, a podium was visible at a clear angle. No catering staff in the sight line, no obstructions. His hand went to the pocket. 4th check. Then he was still again, watching the stage with the focused quality of someone solving a spatial problem. Data points. The shape of a conclusion forming, yet Jeffrey walked toward the service desk near the main corridor where Scott Hill was stationed. Scott Hill was 28. Attentive posture of someone who took the job seriously, and the slightly uncertain quality around the eyes of someone who had not yet been tested by anything that required something beyond attentiveness. Jeffrey liked him for that reason. Certainty without experience was more dangerous than uncertainty with good instincts. He stopped beside him. "I need to report something." Buck looked at him, the genuine calculation of a young professional deciding how to weight an unexpected input. Jeffrey described Gary Young. Precisely. Height, build, the service cart, the movement pattern across the eastern wall, a pocket check. He did not use language that would require Scott to already know what he was listening for. He used visible facts. Things Scott could verify with his own eyes. Scott pulled his radio. A brief check with the catering coordinator, Atiskins. His paperwork cleared this morning. Scott was looking at Jeffrey with a more complex expression now, trying to reconcile the information in front of him with the information he had just received. On the approved vendor list, approved paperwork isn't the same as appropriate behavior. Jeffrey kept his voice level. "I've been in this building for 2 years. I know the catering staff, I know how they move. This man has been in the ballroom for over an hour, and hasn't served a single glass of water. Scott processed this. The weight of it versus the weight of verified documentation. The established security infrastructure of a man like Timothy Clark. A general probability of a world in which hotel maintenance staff didn't usually have better threat assessment instincts than credentialed security professionals. I'll keep an eye on it. Jeffrey had expected that. Thank you, he said. Scott had listened, which was more than the bare minimum and deserved acknowledgement. He walked back toward the supply corridor, and somewhere behind him, Gary Young picked a new position along the eastern wall. By 4 o'clock, Jeffrey had his fifth data point. He had them organized in his mind not as a list, not as a narrative, but as a geometry. Each position Gary Young had taken in the previous hour, and 20 minutes had a sized line to the podium. Identical sight lines. Gary had varied his positions, which meant he was not attached to one angle. He was mapping coverage, testing approaches. The way you prepare for something that requires options rather than a single committed line. Like at check count stood at 5, a second at 2:58, a third at 3:19, a fourth at 3:51, and now a fifth at 3:57. Always the left breast pocket, always the same 2-second press. Always with Gary's eyes on the room rather than down, always without any service work occurring in the immediate vicinity. The cart had been moved 4 times and still held every glass it had started with. 5 data points, a geometry. Jeffrey went back to Scott Hill with the full sequence, timing intervals, specific positions, the sightline pattern, all 5 pocket checks documented with times. He described it without editorializing, just the geometry. Scott listened more carefully this time. The young man was leaning forward slightly, the posture of someone whose instincts were engaged even if his training hadn't caught up yet. I hear what you're saying. The answer came with genuine discomfort. But I can't pull someone off the floor based on behavioral observation when his documentation has been verified through 3 checkpoints. That's not how the protocol works. Oh, how the protocol works. Not said with edge, said as fact. Because it was, Jeffrey walked away and stood for a moment in the service corridor, his back to the wall, doing the math on what he had left. One option. Timothy Clark particularly want to take it. Not because he was concerned about how Timothy would receive him, but because he already had a reasonably accurate model of what Timothy would do with the information, and the model said the same thing that Scott's response had said, with more authority behind it. Still, he had one option. He took it. Timothy Clark was completing a circuit of the 2nd floor when Jeffrey intercepted him near the north stairwell access. Looked at him with the particular patience of a senior security professional who had been interrupted by well-meaning civilians before and had a practiced, measured way of handling it. 60 seconds. Jeffrey said it before Timothy could redirect him. That's what I need. Timothy checked his watch. You have 30. Jeffrey gave him the account in the time available. No interpretation, no advocacy. Acts of Gary Young's movement map pattern laid out in sequence. 5 positions, 5 pocket checks, 1 hour and 17 minutes of observation, 0 items served. He watched Timothy's face while he spoke. Timothy listened. When Jeffrey finished, Timothy's expression had not changed in any visible way. It was itself information. The expression of a man processing something through a framework that had already been established, rather than updating the framework in real time. His credentials were verified at 0800 with its own weight. Catering team confirmed the assignment. Every individual in this space has been processed through a 3-stage background protocol. A pause. I understand you have concerns. Have my team do a visual check, and here, in the specific way Timothy visual check, something clicked, not the words, the phrasing. Secondary sightline confirmation would have been the Marlowe term. Timothy didn't use that phrase, but the rhythm of what he said, the structure of the sentence, the way the word visual was placed as a modifier rather than the noun, carried the cadence of someone who had once been trained in a system that used that exact technical vocabulary. Jeffrey looked at him, not with the recognition of an old colleague, recognition of someone who had just understood something about why this conversation was going exactly the way it was going. Timothy Clark had been in the same training architecture. Maybe not the same cohort, Not the same assignment track, but the same fundamental system, the one that taught you to trust verified documentation over behavioral reads, because behavioral reads were subjective and documentation was concrete. In the absence of a visible weapon or a confirmed threat, you acted on what you could defend in an after-action report. Jeffrey had believed that too. He had stopped believing it at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday in Cincinnati. "That's all I needed to know," Jeffrey said. He walked back toward the supply corridor. He had 1 hour and 23 minutes before the event began, and he had just confirmed beyond any remaining doubt that when the moment came, going to be entirely on his own. At 5 o'clock. The room was filling up in the way event spaces fill in the final preparation hours. Not with guests yet, but with the energy of imminent arrival. The caterers were finishing the table settings. The lighting crew was in its final calibration pass. The florist was still there, working 2 tables simultaneously in the corner. Everything was being pulled toward a specific moment, and the room felt it. Jeffrey moved through the edges of it, stocking supply carts, collecting used prep linens from the service alcoves, doing the work of the building, and the entire time, without visible urgency, without any change in his pace or posture, he tracked Gary Young. They had settled into a new pattern, more economical now, less variation in position. The last 3 stops he had taken were all in the forward half of the room, each one closer to the stage than the one before it. Not dramatically closer, not in a way that would read as movement toward the stage if you weren't already watching. Incrementally, systematically. Closer, the current position, against the western wall between 2 prep tables, partially behind a floor lamp, put Gary approximately 40 feet from the podium with a clear angle. No obstructions. Jeffrey made himself finish the linen run before he sat with what that meant. He went to the supply room, ogged the completed restocking, stood for a moment in the corridor outside. With his hands at his sides and his eyes on the middle distance, he thought about protocol, thought about the 3 checkpoints that Gary Young's credentials had cleared. He thought about Timothy Clark's visual check result in a security professional looking at a man standing beside a service cart with a towel over his arm and documented credentials, and no visible weapon. He thought about the woman named Paulson in a corridor in Cincinnati. Faked about one word, medium probability. He had overridden his own instinct once because the framework said to. Because documentation was concrete and behavioral reads were subjective, as he had deferred to the established architecture of the security system, and the system had turned out to have a gap that a real human being had fallen through. Gary Young had been in this room for over 3 hours, not served a single glass of water. He had mapped every viable angle to the podium. He had checked the left breast pocket of his jacket 5 times across a documented sequence with timestamps. This was not a behavioral read, a pattern, a geometry. 5 data points that described a conclusion with a very specific shape. Jeffrey looked at the service corridor, then at the ballroom entrance, faked. Then he made the decision that the evidence had been building towards since 2:30 in the afternoon. Not because he wanted to be right, but because he needed to prove something to Margaret Wilson, or Timothy Clark, or Scott Hill, or anyone else in the building. Because somewhere in that ballroom, 200 people were going to arrive in 3 hours. One of them had already been there all day, and he was the only person in the building who understood what that person was there to do. He was back at work in 60 seconds. The thing about being invisible was that it required maintenance. Not effort, exactly. More like attention. The way a long-held posture eventually becomes natural, but still requires that you don't forget you're holding it. Jeffrey had been holding his invisibility at the Ashford Grand for 2 years. He had gotten very good at it. The cart, the uniform, the measured pace, the way he oriented his body in a room, slightly away from whatever was happening, slightly toward whatever needed doing. It had taken him 3 months to learn how to do that again after Cincinnati, after the resignation, after the drive south to Nashville with no particular plan. He had found himself unable to be in a room without cataloging it. Exits, positions, lines of movement. The instinct didn't turn off because the job was gone. It just kept running without anything to do, like an engine with no load, generating heat and nothing useful. The maintenance work had actually helped with that, because the building had its own logic to follow, and following it gave the instinct something to do that was useful and finite. Slowly, over months, not weeks, the tactical cataloging had settled into something less urgent, not gone, just integrated, part of how he moved through a space rather than the reason for it. 2 years. But now, the thing he had spent 2 years integrating back into a functional life was looking at Gary Young across a ballroom and recognizing exactly what it was looking at. I pushed the supply cart toward the rear service alcove and ran the checklist one more time. Fact. Gary Young had been in this room since before Jeffrey arrived at 2 in the afternoon. Fact. No member of the actual catering staff had interacted with him in any task-related way across the entire observation window. Fact. The glasses on the service cart remained untouched through 4 relocations. Fact. Left breast pocket check had now occurred 5 times across documented intervals: 2:43:58, 3:19, 3:41, and 3:57. Fact. Gary's current position put him at the closest he had been to the podium all day. Approximately 40 feet, fair angle, no physical obstruction between his standing position and the front of the stage. Fact. Gary's right hand had been loose at his side for the last 8 minutes, not checking, not moving, available. Hands that were available like that weren't idle, they were waiting. He had 1 hour and 30 minutes, and he had already used every official channel available to him. Scott was still monitoring, but Scott was 28 and working within a system that had verified Gary Young 3 times and would not act on behavioral observation without a visible precipitating event. Definition of a visible precipitating event in this context was almost certainly too late. Timothy Clark was completing his pre-event security sweep. They would do a final ballroom pass at 7:15. It would mean a security professional standing in the ballroom with Gary Young 45 minutes before the event started, looking at a man standing beside a service cart with a towel over his arm and documented credentials and no visible weapon. Jeffrey already knew what they would see. He knew because he had been one of them. Arranged out a supply bin in the alcove, loaded a fresh tray of cleaning materials onto the cart, moved back toward the ballroom entrance. He needed to be inside the room, not managing from the corridor inside, positioned a clear line across the floor to wherever Gary Young settled in the next 90 minutes. Close enough that when the moment came, and he was now operating under the conviction that it would come, the geometry had stopped being ambiguous. He would not have to cover more ground than he could cover in the time available. He pushed the cart through the ballroom's service entrance and went back to work. At 6:15, replacing the last bulb in the service alcove fixture near the ballroom's rear access when he heard the first of the evening's arriving vehicles pull under the hotel portico below. The event started at 8. An hour and 45 minutes. He finished the bulb, tested the fixture. The light came on. He set the packaging in the waste bin, picked up his kit, and walked to the window at the end of the corridor. Below, through the glass, H-fill was doing what it did in the early evening. The sky going amber at the edges, the streetlights coming on before they were entirely necessary, the downtown traffic shifting from workday to something else. The city had its own logic, own rhythm. He stood there for exactly 30 seconds. Then he turned and walked back toward the ballroom, because Gary Young was still in there, and Jeffrey Lewis had run out of systems to report to. At 7 o'clock, the guests began arriving. They came through the main entrance in the careful, calibrated clusters of people who had done this many times. Investors with the practiced warmth of relationships built entirely on mutual financial interest. 2 members of the Tennessee State Legislature were working the room with their aides slightly behind them and slightly to the left. The formation of people who needed to remember who mattered and in what order. Several journalists standing slightly apart from the main guest flow, notebooks or phones. The professional observer's instinct to stay adjacent rather than embedded. The room's ambient noise level rose in smooth increments as it filled. Jeffrey moved along the rear service edge, replacing water glasses on the rear tables, collecting the preliminary setup debris from the catering staff's final pass. He was part of the room's infrastructure. Nobody looked at him. Looked at Gary Young. Gary had moved, not far, but significantly, He was now at the front left corner of the room, the same position he had been circling toward all afternoon, the convergence point of his entire day's movement, 8 feet from the podium. The floor lamp to his left created a partial shadow. 2 banquet tables behind him meant no one could approach from the rear. The angle from his position to the podium's front edge was clean, direct, left unobstructed. His left hand was at his side, completely still. The fingers were not restless. They were not checking the pocket again. They had stopped checking because the checking was done. Whatever he had been confirming was confirmed. A 6th pocket check, brief, different from the others. Not the confirming press of before, more like a final verification. A man making sure a door was still unlocked before he walked through it. Jeffrey set down the tray of water glasses, began moving, not running, not changing his posture, altering his path through the room with the seamless purposefulness of someone who had just remembered something that needed attention on the other side. Past the rear guest tables, found the second cluster of investors, along the outer edge of the room, keeping to the perimeter. The cart left behind because he was too far into this to manage the cart anymore. He was 40 feet from Gary Young, then 30. Katie Clark stepped directly into his path. Timothy had been watching the room from the VIP section edge, and he had seen Jeffrey moving. A maintenance employee, increasing pace, heading toward the front of the secured event space, while the principal was about to take the stage. And Timothy's training had processed this input the way it was designed to process it. He stepped in front of Jeffrey and put one hand up. Flat, final. The authority of a man who had not expected to be questioned tonight. Staff are not permitted in the forward floor section during the principal's address. Jeffrey looked at him, then past him. At the front left corner, where Gary Young's left hand had come up slightly from his side, there's a man at the front left corner who is about to move on the stage. He kept his voice low, his eyes steady. White jacket, towel over his left arm, standing between the floor lamp and the stage edge. You need to look at him right now. Return to the service area. Timothy, he used the name plainly, without heat, without deference. I have been watching this man for 6 hours. Has not served a single item. He has moved systematically through this room all afternoon, mapping every angle to that stage. I have 5 documented observations with timestamps. Left hand has been at his side without moving for 16 minutes. Look at him. Something moved in Timothy's eyes. Not nothing. Something real. A flicker of recalculation, a fraction of a second in which training and hierarchy and the weight of every decision made today were measured against the specific quality of what Jeffrey Lewis was saying and the way he was saying it. But the training won. Almost always won. Returned to the service area. The tone shifted, not dismissive anymore, but the flat, immovable weight of a man who is committed to a position. That is the last time I will say it. Jeffrey looked past Timothy's shoulder. Left Young shifted his weight forward. His left hand came up. On the stage, Margaret Wilson was adjusting the microphone, and Jeffrey Lewis made the only decision the next 3 seconds allowed. Didn't think about it. That was the thing. There was no decision, not the way decisions usually worked. The weighing, the hesitation, the small internal argument between what you wanted to do and what the situation required. That process had already happened. It had happened over 6 hours, across 40 feet of ballroom floor, across 5 documented observations and 6 pocket checks and 1 very final look at a hand that had stopped moving. Decision had been made before Timothy Clark stepped in front of him. What happened now was just execution. Jeffrey moved left. Not a lunge, not a collision, redirect. The specific sideways pivot that creates a new geometry between 2 bodies, the one where the person being redirected finds their own momentum, suddenly pointed somewhere it wasn't pointing before. Timothy's reaching hand came up fast and professionally because Timothy was very good at what he did, and Jeffrey had been trained in the same system, and he knew exactly where that hand was going to be before it got there. He caught the wrist, hard, firm, redirected it past his own body in a single fluid arc that used Timothy's reach against itself. They then stepped behind him and found the specific point on the right shoulder where the deltoid meets the trapezius. The pressure intersection that the Marlowe program had spent 2 full training days on, because it was the one takedown that controlled without damaging, that bought seconds without buying enemies. Timothy Clark, trained, experienced, 50 pounds heavier, and completely unprepared for someone his own system would have called a peer, went to one knee on the ballroom carpet with a sound that was more surprise than pain. 3 seconds. Akefree held the position for one more, long enough to be certain Timothy wasn't coming up in the next 5, then released and moved. He was running now, not a sprint. More like the controlled urgency of someone who understood that the difference between making it and not making it was going to be measured in seconds, aimed at a full sprint through a room with 200 people in formal attire would cause a panic that would make everything worse. He moved through the gap between the second and third row of guest tables, past a woman in a blue dress who took a half step back without fully understanding why, past an investor who turned at the disturbance and then very quickly turned back. Gary Young was 30 feet away. Then 20. On the stage, Margaret Wilson had not heard what happened behind her. The room's ambient noise absorbed the brief commotion at the VIP section edge, the way large rooms absorb small disruptions, incompletely, with a ripple, but not a wave. Like some guests near the back had turned. Most had not. Margaret was at the podium, her voice carrying with the practiced assurance of someone who had rehearsed this opening until the words had their own momentum. Gary's left hand came all the way up. Blaze went into the breast pocket. Jeffrey closed the last 15 feet. His left hand came down on Gary's wrist as the object cleared the pocket. Not the confirming press of before, the full retrieval, like of the thing Gary Young had been building toward all day. The angle changed immediately, downward, away from the stage. Jeffrey's right hand caught the elbow, and the combined pressure of both arms and his full body weight, and the wall 3 feet behind them did the rest. The impact was controlled. It had to be. This was a ballroom with 200 people, and a woman at a podium 40 feet away, controlled, not gentle. Gary hit the wall with enough force to knock the breath out of him cleanly and eliminate any coordination in his arms, and the compact black pistol, which had cleared the pocket and been in Gary's hand for approximately 1 second before the hand stopped being his to use, clattered to the ballroom floor. Jeffrey stepped on it. The sound was not loud. It was specific. Metal on marble has a particular register that human hearing sorts out from background noise even in a crowded room, even when you aren't consciously listening for it. Closest to the front left corner heard it and understood it before they could have articulated what they understood. The intake of breath spread backward through the room, the way a pulse moves through water. Then the room went very still. As not silent. There was still ambient noise. The building's ventilation, the residual shuffle of 200 people processing something their minds hadn't prepared for. Like someone near the back making a short, sharp sound that might have been a scream or might have been a name. But the room's collective energy had changed in the space between one breath and the next. The air changes in the 2 seconds before weather arrives, and everyone outside feels it before they can name it. Margaret Wilson had stopped speaking. She stood at the podium with her hands at her sides, looking at the front left corner of the room, and her expression had not yet resolved into anything recognizable. Not fear, not relief, not the managed composure she had worn for the previous 7 hours, as the expression of a person in the exact moment before understanding arrives. A held breath, a suspended frame. Jeffrey kept Gary Young pressed against the wall. Gary was not fighting him. Breath had gone out of him cleanly, and his arms had no coordination left, and he was in the specific shock that follows a rapid, precise physical intervention. The body's brief systems reset before adrenaline clarifies the situation. Eyes were on Jeffrey, not afraid exactly, processing, don't move, not loud. He didn't need to be loud. Gary didn't move. On the stage, the secondary security team appeared at the stage access point, 2 of Timothy's personnel, responding to the radio call that had gone out in the seconds after the wrist redirect. They moved toward the podium, positioning Margaret Wilson between them and the room, the protective formation that Timothy's team had trained for. Margaret let them position her without resistance, which was the response of someone who understood what was happening, even if she had not yet fully processed it. Timothy Clark's other 2 personnel came from the main entrance at a controlled run, led the scene without needing to be briefed. Man pinned against wall, weapon on the floor, Maintenance employee with his foot on it, principal on stage, room in arrested motion. Their training handled the rest. Eddie himself came behind them, moving at the elevated pace of someone managing the gap between what his body wanted to do and what the situation required. He had been on one knee for approximately 4 seconds. He was upright and functional, but the specific coordination of a man who had taken an unexpected physical intervention was still working itself back to baseline. He moved with slightly more deliberateness than his normal efficiency, at the visible sign of someone running conscious checks on systems that usually ran automatically. He looked at Jeffrey, then at Gary, then at the pistol on the floor. The team took Gary from Jeffrey's grip, professionally, efficiently. Sets of hands, a controlled escort toward the side exit, no dramatic language, no escalation. Gary went without resistance. The resignation of someone who had understood for 10 seconds now that the thing he had spent 14 months preparing for was over, completely and irreversibly, before it had properly begun. Timothy stepped to the side of the cleared space and spoke into his radio in a low, rapid voice, coordinating the room's security posture from a stationary position rather than moving through it himself. It was the operationally correct decision. The team lead managed from a fixed point while personnel moved. It was also, Jeffrey noted without comment, a response of a man who was still recalibrating his physical systems, and had the professional judgment to account for that honestly. Machinery of professional security, the machinery that should have been pointed at Gary Young 6 hours ago, was finally, fully, completely operational. Jeffrey stepped away from the wall, picked up the towel that had fallen from Gary's arm during the takedown, folded it once, the automatic neatness of 2 years of maintenance habit, set it on the nearest table, pressed the folded edge briefly against his right palm. A wall bracket's edge had caught the skin during the controlled impact, assessed the cut. Minor. Let it go. He stood in the corner of the ballroom and breathed. The room did not panic. That was the thing Jeffrey noticed, standing at the edge of the cleared space while Timothy's team moved through it with controlled purpose. 200 people, a gun on the floor, a man being escorted out in a grip that communicated exactly what kind of escort it was, and the room did not panic. Some guests had moved toward the exits instinctively, automatic response of people whose nervous systems were smarter than their conscious minds in the first 3 seconds of a crisis. Most were standing where they had been standing, completely still, the particular stillness of people who understood something had just happened but had not yet decided how to hold it. A few had phones out. Most didn't seem to know whether what they had just witnessed was real enough to photograph. They understood that. The mind struggled with the abrupt adjacency of real danger and ordinary life. At the ballroom with its warm lighting and its carefully arranged centerpieces and its 200 guests in formal attire, it was not a context that accommodated what had just happened. The mind tried to find a frame that made it coherent. There wasn't one. There never was. Margaret Wilson had stepped back from the podium but had not left the stage. She was standing slightly to the left of the microphone, her hands clasped in front of her. The physical language of someone making themselves stay in a specific location rather than someone who simply happens to be there. She was looking at the front left corner of the room, at Jeffrey. Look was different from the one she had given him this afternoon when he was on the wrong side of the stanchion rope. That look had been a measurement, the quick evaluation of someone who had decided in advance what the measurement would find: position, role, uniform, side of the rope, conclusion made, file closed. This look had no conclusion in it. It was still going. It was the look of someone whose file had been opened again, and who was discovering it contained things they had not put there, and could not account for with any framework they currently possessed. A chair near the service wall and sat down. His hands were steady, his breathing was even. He had a small cut on his right palm. These were the facts. Stephanie Harris arrived with the first response unit at 7:53, fast by any reasonable metric. The call had gone through hotel security at approximately 7:42, and Nashville PD's response to an incident at the Ashford Grand involving a firearm and a corporate event with political guests was going to be a high-priority dispatch, regardless of what else was happening in the city that evening. Like she came through the ballroom's main entrance with the particular deliberateness of a detective who understood that the first thing you did at a scene was read it, not manage it. Late 40s, a kind of face that had spent a long time listening to difficult things and had learned to keep those things from appearing on it. She swept the room in the same three-point pattern Jeffrey had seen Timothy use that morning: left anchor, right anchor, center depth, trained. He noted it automatically. She found Jeffrey sitting in the chair near the service wall and came directly to him, which meant someone had already pointed her in his direction. And Timothy had given her a preliminary account that placed Jeffrey at the center of what had happened. She had a notepad, the kind people used before tablets and continued using after, like some information settled better in handwriting than in a digital field. Detective Stephanie Harris, Nashville PD. She sat down in the chair beside his. Beside, not across, at roughly his angle to the room. I understand you're the one who stopped him. I identified him earlier today and intervened when he moved on the stage. What time did you first notice him? Jeffrey told her. He gave her the timeline in sequence. 2:43 p.m., first observation, late first pocket check. Through the 4 additional checks at documented intervals, through both conversations with Scott Hill. Through the account he had given Timothy Clark at approximately 6:30, the final 7 minutes in the ballroom when Gary Young had moved into his terminal position. Through the intervention at 7:41, he kept his language precise. No interpretation unless she asked for it. No commentary on what had followed when he reported. Just the facts of what he had observed and what he had done. Stephanie Harris wrote everything down in a small, consistent script and asked her questions in a sequence that told Jeffrey she had already understood the shape of the thing before he confirmed the details. She was not building her picture from scratch, like filling in the outlines of a picture she had sketched from the preliminary reports, and was now coloring in with specifics when she reached the point where Jeffrey described redirecting Timothy Clark. She looked up from the notepad. She put the head of the principal's private security team on one knee. I redirected him. He was blocking access to the threat. I used the minimum necessary physical intervention to get past him without causing injury or compromising his operational capacity in the seconds that followed. And you knew how to do that because I have some background in personal protection work. She looked at him, the specific look of a professional whose question has been answered correctly but not completely. What kind of background? DOJ contractor. Protection detail. Left the field about 3 years ago. She wrote something. Did not follow up immediately, which meant she was deciding whether to follow up now or later. You've been working maintenance at this hotel for how long? 2 years. Those 2 years, had you ever had reason to use your prior training in a work context? No. Until tonight, she wrote something else, thanked him, told him they would be in touch, moved to the next person on her list. Jeffrey sat in the chair for another moment. The room was still processing itself around him, Timothy's team moving in their systematic patterns, the remaining guests clustered in the ways that people cluster after shared disruption. Asheville, additional personnel filtering in through the main entrance to begin the formal scene management that would take the rest of the evening. Then Sandra Anderson appeared beside him with a water bottle and the careful expression of someone carrying a message from someone considerably more senior. Miss Wilson would like to speak with you. Sandra held the bottle out. Ready. Jeffrey took the water, stood up. I'm ready now. Home they took him to was off the ballroom's south corridor, the VIP holding suite that the Ashford Grand maintained for exactly this kind of adjacent-to-event need. Small and quiet, 2 sofas and a low table of the investigation outside, reduced to a distant procedural murmur by the room's heavy door. Jeffrey had restocked the supply cart that served this corridor 47 times in 2 years. He had never been inside the room itself. Margaret Wilson was standing when he walked in. Not at the window, not at the table. In the center of the room, which was a choice. Standing in the center of a room was not the posture of someone who had been sitting and risen when the door opened. It was the posture of someone who had decided to be standing before the door opened. She had removed the structured jacket from her event presentation. The white blouse beneath it made her look like a different version of herself. Not smaller, not diminished, but more present somehow. Like the jacket had been load-bearing in a specific way, and without it she was carrying her own weight more directly. Her arms were crossed, not defensively, the posture of someone who needed something to hold on to while they organized a set of thoughts that did not have an obvious order. Timothy Clark was in the room, far wall, looked at Jeffrey when he entered with the expression of a man who had spent the last hour doing a very specific kind of accounting and had arrived at a number he did not like and could not dispute. Margaret did not open with anything ambient, like Dawes, consistent with everything Jeffrey had observed about her since 9:14 that morning. "I've been told you," reported the suspect to hotel security at approximately 4 o'clock this afternoon, and to Timothy directly at approximately 6:30. She said it the way she said everything, precisely. Implication that she had verified the information before using it. That's correct. And neither of them acted on it. The documentation had been verified. From a protocol standpoint, they made the decision the system told them to make. They paused. The system had a gap. Gary Young found it and used it. That's a problem with the verification architecture, not with the people who relied on it. A beat of silence. Margaret's expression shifted slightly. Not dramatically. Puffed. Not visibly enough that someone who wasn't looking carefully would have caught it. But Jeffrey was looking carefully. What he saw was the specific micro-adjustment of someone who has just been treated more fairly than the situation required, and is recalibrating what that means about the person in front of them. "You still acted," she said. "Both of them turned you away. Someone had to. He didn't add to them." The 3 words were complete. Margaret unfolded her arms. She looked at him with the long, still quality of someone revising a calculation they had considered settled. The look she had been pointing in his direction since the moment on stage when the room stopped. He could not have predicted from the woman, even who had told him this afternoon that people in his position did not belong inside secured perimeters and could not understand the decisions that kept events like this safe. That woman and this woman had the same face and the same voice, and were separated by approximately 4.5 hours and one very small piece of metal on a ballroom floor. "I said some things to you this afternoon." She stopped, started again with more precision. "I made an assessment based on your position here and what I assumed about you because of that position, and I was wrong about it." Her voice was steady. Steadiness costs something. The stability of a person holding difficult weight, not the stability of a person who isn't holding anything. "Significantly wrong." Jeffrey said nothing. Not silence as agreement. Not silence as recrimination. Just silence. Because what she was saying needed room to be said, and he was not going to fill that room with reassurance he didn't feel or anger he wasn't carrying. "What I said in that ballroom this afternoon," she paused again, empty this time, not searching for words but sitting with the weight of specific ones. "I said it in front of my team, my executives. I said it the way I sometimes say things that I intend to be heard by more than one person. The things I said were wrong. Not imprecise. Wrong." Her eyes were direct. "That's not how I should operate. It's not how I would want anyone in my organization to operate. The fact that I did it in that specific context, when you were the only person in the room who understood what was actually happening," she stopped. This time the stop was not about language at all. It was about something harder than language, a specific difficulty of a person who has just been shown something accurate about themselves and is in the first minutes of living with it. "I owe you an apology. A real one. I'm sorry." The room held it, looked at her, and saw that she meant it. Not as performance. Not the managed accountability of someone who had decided that apologizing was strategically correct. Meant it the way people mean things when they have been shown themselves in a mirror that doesn't flatter and cannot be argued with. "I appreciate that," he said, and he did. Simply, directly, without ceremony. Timothy pushed off the far wall and walked to the center of the room. He stopped a few feet from Jeffrey and extended his hand. When Jeffrey took it, Timothy held the grip a moment longer than the gesture required, the additional second of a man making sure the thing he was about to say was going to land the way it needed to land. "I should have listened to you." His voice was direct. No qualification, no structural softening, no contextualizing language that would have diluted the admission by explaining it. Not just the last time you came to me, the first time. Let me a complete account with documented observations, and I ran it through the system, and the system said the documentation was clean, and I let that be the end of it. The person in that ballroom tonight was a consequence of that decision. He held Jeffrey's gaze. You have my respect. For whatever that's worth from where I'm standing right now, it's worth something, Jeffrey said. And he meant that too. Hasty released his hand and seemed to want to say more, and then seemed to decide that what he had said was complete, and that adding to it would make it smaller, which was the right instinct. Jeffrey had seen men apologize badly before, with addenda, with context, with the subtle repositioning that transformed an apology into an explanation. Timothy Clark apologized the way a trained professional made a difficult technical correction, nicely, without excess motion, and then stopped. The door opened slightly and Sandra Anderson's face appeared. Detective Harris needs Mr. Clark. Her voice was careful. When he has a moment, Timothy looked at Jeffrey once more. Something in his face had changed since the ballroom. Something foundational, the kind of shift that doesn't return to its previous configuration once it has occurred. He nodded once and went. The door closed. The room held its quiet. Margaret looked at Jeffrey for a moment longer with the recalibrating look that had apparently not finished its work yet. Sandra will find you if there's anything further you need tonight, she said. I'll be fine, she nodded once, waiting, and that was enough. Tacticians, the investigation machinery continued through the night with the comprehensive thoroughness of an agency that understood the political geography of the Ashford Grand's guest list. Jeffrey gave his formal statement to Detective Harris a second time, in a smaller room off the hotel's administrative corridor, with a recording device and a procedural formality that the initial conversation had not required. Gave it the same way he had given it the first time. Facts, sequence, actions, no editorial content. Harris asked more specific questions this time, the technical questions of a detective who had done her background reading in the intervening hour and had learned enough about DOJ contractor programs to ask better questions about the shoulder restraint and the pistol redirect and the specific decision to go through Timothy Clark rather than around him. Backward. Going around would have been faster, Harris observed. Going around would have injured a trained professional in the middle of an active security event. Professional who was going to need to function effectively in the seconds that followed. The controlled takedown meant he was out of position for precisely as long as necessary and operational immediately after. Harris wrote something, measured that in the moment. It was a judgment based on available information. She put the pen down briefly, which was the first time she had put the pen down during the interview. Mr. Lewis? Came to this hotel 2 years ago and took a maintenance position with a background that, from what I understand, and I understand more than you've told me, would have qualified you for considerably more senior work amongst the work I have. Why? Jeffrey looked at the recording device, then at Harris. Because the work I was trained for requires a specific kind of certainty, he said. About your own judgment, your own read of a situation. I had an incident that compromised that certainty. I needed to find it again on my own terms, not on a timeline someone else set. Did you find it? Ate about 5 data points and 6 pocket checks and the specific geometry of a man standing 40 feet from a stage with his hand moving toward a pocket that had not been empty all day. Like about the decision that hadn't been a decision because it had already been made by the time Timothy Clark stepped in front of him. I think that's what tonight was, Jeffrey said. Harris picked up her pen. Results of the investigation assembled over the following 72 hours from Gary Young's background, his financial records, the vendor company he had used to construct the false credentials, based on the specific nature of the grievance he had carried into the Ashford Grand's ballroom. Gary Young was 45 years old. He had spent 12 years in logistics coordination for infrastructure development projects, last 4 of which had included contract work adjacent to projects in Wilson Infrastructure Group's supply chain. In 2022, a contract dispute between his company and a Wilson Infrastructure subsidiary had ended without resolution. His firm had been dropped from a multi-year arrangement over a compliance issue that Gary had contested through 2 rounds of internal arbitration and 1 external mediation process, both of which had concluded against him. Recover. It wound down 18 months after the contract loss. Gary Young had spent the following year watching what remained of his professional network close around him, watching the mediation findings get cited in subsequent bid evaluations he submitted, watching the gap between what he had built and what was left of it become permanent rather than temporary. And a shell company he built to access the Ashford Grand had been registered in Memphis in late 2023, 14 months before the October event, a business name similar to a legitimate regional catering service, registered address at a real location, a defunct printing business whose previous owners had no knowledge their former commercial address was being used. The forged authorization documents had been constructed with enough technical specificity to pass the standard 3-checkpoint verification process that Timothy Clark's team used, a weakness in the cross-referencing protocol between vendor registration systems and active catering assignment records. A gap small enough to have gone unnoticed and large enough for someone with Gary Young's level of operational patience to walk through. Based on 14 months of methodical, patient construction, Timothy Clark's team documented the gap with the thorough, unsentimental rigor of professionals who understood that documentation was the first step toward ensuring no one else could use it. After-action report contained 17 specific protocol adjustments. Some architectural, changes to the verification system itself, some behavioral, changes to how the team was trained to weight observational evidence against documentation in the final pre-event window. One item in the report had to do with a specific training module about the difference between a verified credential and verified behavior. The distinction Jeffrey had tried to make to Scott Hill at 4 in the afternoon in a service corridor with 40 minutes of observation data and a clear-eyed understanding of where the verification system ended and where human judgment needed to begin. Gary Young was charged with attempted assault with a deadly weapon and criminal possession of a firearm at a public event. Because the event had included elected officials among its guests, the federal component attached, which changed both the jurisdictional framework and the sentencing exposure significantly. The case moved through the system with the efficiency that attended clean evidence and credible witnesses. He was remanded pending trial. Legal process did what legal processes do when the facts are unambiguous and the documentation is thorough. Jeffrey clocked out at 11:43 that night, nearly 4 hours after his shift was supposed to end. Drove home through a Nashville that had gone quiet in the specific way cities go quiet after 10 o'clock. On weeknights, the downtown lights still running, but the streets carrying a fraction of the earlier traffic. Ate a sandwich he found in his refrigerator. Was in bed by 12:30. The alarm was set for 5. The Ashford Grand's brass fixtures did not polish themselves. Ushered. And the building did not particularly care what had happened in its ballroom that evening. It required the same attention it always required. Jeffrey found that grounding rather than indifferent. He slept. A scheduled event happened on a Thursday. Jeffrey knew because Laura Clark put it in the maintenance calendar with a red notation, Grand Ballroom. All-day hold, no maintenance access after 10 a.m. I saw it when he reviewed the week's schedule on Monday morning, standing at the supply room desk with his coffee, the way he reviewed every week's schedule. He noted the date, made the necessary adjustments to his own work plan, saved the corridor restocking to Wednesday, shifted the second-floor fitness center deep clean to Friday. That was the extent of what the rescheduled event meant to the maintenance calendar. He went back to work. Friday came the way Thursdays came, without ceremony, without announcement, just the building waking up in the particular sequence it always woke up in. The freight elevator running at 6:15, a kitchen ventilation coming online at 6:30. The first catering deliveries arriving at the service dock by 7, the specific percussion of stacked equipment being moved off trucks in the early morning quiet. Jeffrey was on the 3rd floor when the catering team started their setup. He could hear them below, the organized energy of people who had done this before and knew the rhythm of it. Different team than last time. Same rhythm. Welding absorbed them the way it absorbed everything, purposefully and without comment. He replaced 2 bulbs in the east corridor, logged them, moved on. By 11, the grand ballroom was sealed. By noon, the second-floor corridor outside it had the particular quality of air that large sealed spaces create. A slight pressure differential, a muted quality to the ambient sound. The room was doing something. Something was being prepared inside it. But Jeffrey worked the west corridor and did not think about what was happening on the other side of the wall, or he tried not to. The thing was, and this was the thing he had not expected, he was not indifferent to it. He had expected to be. He had developed a clean, functional indifference over 2 years for the hotel's events, the investment conferences and the awards dinners, and the quarterly board meetings of companies whose names he read on the catering order sheets and then forgot. I had expected this event to fall into the same category. It didn't, not because of what had happened, not because of Margaret Wilson or Timothy Clark or the private room with the heavy door or the handshakes afterward. I didn't fall into the same category because of what the event itself represented. 3 years of work by a group of people towards something that was supposed to matter, disrupted by one man's unresolved grievance, and then rescheduled and attempted again, the trying again part. That was the part he found he couldn't be entirely indifferent to. He finished the west corridor and moved to the service stairwell. Scott Hill found him at 2 in the afternoon. Jeffrey was in the supply room on the main floor, restocking the cart for the afternoon's work. When Scott came through the door with the particular quality of movement that distinguished a person who has sought you out from a person who happens to be in the same space. Scott was in his full uniform, standing differently than Jeffrey remembered from their conversations in October. The posture of someone who had been through something and had not come out the other side unchanged. Not harder, more settled. The specific quality of a person who has done the work of understanding something difficult and has arrived somewhere on the other side of it. I wanted to say something, Scott began, and then stopped, as the accurate response to the difficulty of the thing he was trying to say. Jeffrey waited. I listened to you at 4 o'clock. Scott looked at him directly. I logged the interaction. I did the radio check. And then I let the documentation overrule what you were telling me, because that's what the system said to do, and I was 28 years old. And the system felt more reliable than a maintenance employee's read of a server's body language. A pause. That was wrong. I've been thinking about it for 3 weeks. It was wrong and I should have pushed harder up the chain. You were working within a system that wasn't designed to accommodate what you were seeing, Jeffrey said. I was working within a system that I was too junior and too certain about to question. Scott's jaw tightened slightly. That's different. A system is a tool. I was the one using it. Jeffrey looked at him. 28 years old, standing in a supply room on a Thursday afternoon, making the specific distinction between structural failure and personal failure that a lot of people twice his age still couldn't make clearly, or wouldn't. That's the right way to look at it, Jeffrey said. Tim Clark's team revised the verification protocol. Scott said it like he was building towards something. There's a new training module on behavioral assessment in the pre-event window. They brought me in to contribute to the case study. A pause. They used your timeline, your specific observations from 4 o'clock through 7:40. Jeffrey said nothing. I thought you should know that what you documented that afternoon is now part of how this team trains. Scott's voice had a rough quality. Not emotional exactly, but the specific roughness of someone saying something that matters to them in a context where mattering is not easy to express. That it'll keep going. Even after everything, Jeffrey finished loading the cart. Thank you for telling me, they said. And he meant it, not as a social courtesy, but as genuine acknowledgement of something that Scott had come to the supply room to do, which had required more of him than he had probably anticipated when he planned the conversation. Scott nodded once, moved toward the door. Then stopped with his hand on the frame. The vendor company, he said, the shell Gary Young used. Registered in Memphis in late 2023. Legit address, defunct business. Employees who didn't know their identities had been borrowed. The registration date was 14 months before the event. He looked at Jeffrey. He spent 14 months building that credential. Jeffrey looked at him. 14 months, like Scott said, and it still only needed one person, paying the right kind of attention to catch it. He went through the door. Jeffrey stood in the supply room for a moment, his hands on the cart handles. 14 months of methodical, patient construction, and 6 hours of equally methodical, patient observation. Two kinds of patience pointed in opposite directions. The whole shape of the evening, had been determined by which one reached its conclusion first, pushed the cart into the corridor, and went back to work. The event was still running at 7 in the evening. Jeffrey could tell from the grand ballroom's energy signature, the specific quality of occupied stillness that large formal events produced, edible in the building's structure if you knew how to listen for it. A vibration that wasn't quite sound. The collective presence of 200 people in a shared formal moment, even transmitted through 40 feet of marble and steel and plaster to the floors above. He was on the 4th floor, checking the HVAC access panel that had been on the maintenance list for 11 days, and he thought about Margaret Wilson standing at a podium in a room that had tried to hurt her 3 weeks ago and had not succeeded, getting back up, not the dramatic version. The version that required an audience or a declaration or a statement to the press about resilience. Just returning to the thing you had been trying to do, with the adjustments that reality had required and doing it, continuing. Most ordinary form of courage and the least celebrated. He had done that himself once, driven south with no destination, and found a building that needed attention and given it what it needed, and done that again the next day and the day after that. Not dramatic, not declarative, just the return. To the HVAC panel's problem, a loose fitting on the return duct that had been vibrating at frequency against the mounting bracket, a specific resonance that translated 2 floors down into a faint but reportable hum in the 3rd floor rooms. He tightened it. The vibration stopped. He logged the repair, noted that the fitting should be rechecked in 2 weeks to confirm the tightening held under sustained operational load. Moved on. Laura Clark told him about the event the following morning, in the way she told him things, practically, a building manager's prioritization of relevant operational information. She did the full presentation. Laura was reviewing the morning's facility report. Ran about 40 minutes. The press coverage started last night, ongoing this morning. The infrastructure project is formally announced. A pause. She looked tired, but she delivered it. Jeffrey made a note about the 4th floor HVAC fitting and its 2-week recheck. Good, he said. Like some of the original guest list declined the rescheduled invitation. She knew they would. Laura looked at him sideways. How do you know that? People who operate at that level always account for the cost of continuing, Jeffrey said. I've anticipated the attrition, factored it in, proceeded anyway. Sarah studied him for a moment with the expression she occasionally deployed when Jeffrey said something that reminded her his personnel file was somewhat incomplete. The expression of a person deciding whether to ask a follow-up question and then deciding against it. A coverage was favorable, she said finally, and returned to the facility report. Jeffrey finished his coffee and picked up his kit. The week after the event, Stephanie Harris called, not a formal follow-up. That had already occurred, procedural loop closed, the case file building toward the outcome that clean evidence and credible witnesses tended to produce. This call was different. Harris was direct about that immediately. Off the record, she said, which was a phrase that meant something specific when a detective used it. Jeffrey was in his car in the hotel parking structure, eating lunch there most days, because the employee break room ran loud at noon, and he preferred the quiet of the structure's concrete levels, the specific quality of a space that existed to hold things between their uses. Go ahead. The restraint you used on Clark. The pistol, redirect on Young. The decision-making in real time with 200 civilians in the room. A pause. That's not background. That's current. It was current 3 years ago, Jeffrey said. Years of maintenance work hasn't degraded it. Apparently not. Another pause. X had a specific quality of silence. The silence of someone deciding whether to say the next thing not because they're uncertain it's true, but because they're uncertain it's their place to say it. They spent some time looking into the Marlowe program, she said. It's not easy to look into. No, I found enough to understand that the people selected for it were chosen for a specific combination of things: pattern recognition, and capability, judgment under pressure, a particular kind of patience. Another pause. You've been using 3 of those 4 every day in that hotel. Jeffrey looked at the parking structure's concrete ceiling, a specific texture of poured concrete at 40 feet, rough, honest, indifferent to everything that happened below it. The 4th one, too, he said, just at a different scale. Harris was quiet for a moment. Then, the case is solid, Eckerton. Young is looking at federal charges in addition to the state counts because of the elected officials present at the event. The federal component changes the sentencing exposure significantly. His office was complimentary is the word they used about the precision of your statement. The documented timeline held up under every review. She paused. I've been a detective for 19 years. I've taken a lot of witness statements. This was the most precisely organized account of a 6-hour observation window I've ever documented. Jeffrey said nothing to that. I'm not recruiting you, Harris said. I'm just saying it, I know. Thank you. Take care of yourself, Ois. He finished his lunch in the quiet of the parking structure, listening to the building above him doing its building things. Then he went back upstairs. The second thing that happened that week was the envelope, not from Margaret Wilson directly, from Sandra Anderson. On Wilson Infrastructure Group letterhead, delivered through Laura Clark with the specific formality of something that had been prepared with considerable care. Laura brought it to Jeffrey on a Wednesday afternoon, with the careful neutrality of someone who had read the return address and decided that the contents were not her business. Jeffrey opened it in the supply room. Inside was a formal letter on Wilson Infrastructure stationery, the kind of letter with a specific architectural purpose, opening language and closing language and substance in between that had been drafted by someone who drafted important documents professionally. The substance was an offer. Director of Security, Wilson Infrastructure Group. Scope, compensation, reporting structure, start date. All the formal elements of a serious professional offer, laid out with the precision that Margaret Wilson apparently brought to everything she did. And at the bottom, below the formal closing, writing rather than print. This is not an obligation, it is an acknowledgement. Whatever you decide, what you did in that room has already changed how we operate. M.W. Jeffrey read the letter twice. Then he set it on the supply room shelf and went to do the afternoon's work. He thought about it through the remainder of Wednesday, through Thursday, through Friday morning, both about the weight of operating in the Marlowe register. Not the training, not the specific skills, but the weight of what it required day to day. The constant tactical awareness, the way it colonized your relationship with every room you entered, every crowd you moved through, every person whose movement pattern you automatically catalogued. The specific kind of exhaustion that came not from the work itself, but from the ongoing requirement to hold yourself at that level of readiness, regardless of whether the situation called for it. He had done it for years, had been very good at it, and it had cost him something that he had not understood the full cost of until he was no longer paying it. About a building with 17 brass fixtures on the 2nd floor and a cart bracket on the 3rd floor that nobody fixed for weeks, and a 4th floor HVAC fitting that had been vibrating at resonance for 11 days before he found it. A building that needed the same attention every day, without escalation, without emergency, without the cost of sustained tactical readiness. A building that received what you gave it, and required more and never thanked you, and was always there in the morning. Art about driving south without a destination, and finding Nashville and finding the Ashford Grand and filling out the maintenance application with just enough general detail to satisfy the screening process. A specific relief of a job that had boundaries, that ended at a specific time, that left you in the evening with something remaining. On Friday afternoon, he drafted a response. Blake thanked Margaret Wilson and Sandra Anderson for the offer and for the consideration it represented. Declined, clearly, without apology, without lengthy explanation, through the kind of professional letter that communicated respect for the offer and finality about the answer in the same breath, without requiring either party to revisit the question. He gave it to Laura to send through the building's outgoing mail. That was that. 2 days after the formal letter went out, Margaret Wilson came back to the Ashford Grand. They had a meeting with Laura Clark about the logistics of the rescheduled event's follow-up. 40 minutes in the management suite on the ground floor, substantive and efficient. Jeffrey heard about it from Laura afterward, like specific information that a building manager conveys to her maintenance staff when a high-profile client has recently been involved in a significant incident. The relationship was intact. The client was satisfied with the hotel's handling of the aftermath. Future bookings were likely. Jeffrey thanked her and went back to the maintenance log. He was in the second-floor service corridor that afternoon, late, doing a follow-up check on the third-floor cart bracket that had finally been properly repaired the previous week, when he heard the elevator and the specific quality of footsteps that indicated someone who was not a hotel employee. He turned. Margaret Wilson was at the far end of the corridor, having come from the direction of the elevator bank. She was in a suit different from the one she had worn on the night of the event, less formal, still precise, a quality of clothing chosen for a working day rather than a presentation. She was alone. Sandra Anderson was not 2 steps behind her. She walked toward him and stopped at an appropriate distance and looked at him with a recalibrating look, apparently not finished its work yet. I told my executive team what happened. Her voice was the same as it was in every context, direct, without preamble, all of it. Including what I said to you in the ballroom. Jeffrey waited. Some of them already knew. They were in the room. How did they take it? The way people take things when they already knew and were waiting to see if you were going to say them yourself. She paused. Sandra had a comment that I won't repeat, but that was accurate. Jeffrey did not ask what the comment was. Margaret's expression suggested it had been pointed and deserved. I had Sandra reach out to you through the hotel about the position, looked at him steadily. You declined, I did. I'd like to understand why. Not as a critique, I'm asking because the answer matters to me. Jeffrey looked at the bracket he had been checking. Fixed now, finally. A repair contractor had come on Tuesday. Jeffrey had verified the work on Wednesday. Follow-up check today confirmed it was holding correctly. I chose this about 3 years ago, he said. Not the specific job, the kind of life, all of it, the hours. The way it fits inside a day without requiring anything from the day that the day can't give. He paused. It took me a while to find something that fit that well, and it does. That's not something I'm looking to trade away for a different kind of weight. Margaret absorbed this. That's not the answer I expected. I know. She was quiet for a moment, looking at him not with the measurement of their first encounter, but with something closer to the attention of someone reading a text they find genuinely interesting and are taking their time with. The position isn't going anywhere, she said. That changes. I'll keep it in mind. Something moved across her face that was not quite a smile but occupied the same space. Can I ask you something else? He waited. You came to Timothy twice. He turned you away both times. You came back, chose her next words carefully. Most people would have not let it go exactly, but found a way to live with having done what they could. What made you keep going? Jeffrey looked at the corridor. Amber light coming through the window at the far end. The Ashford Grand settling into its afternoon rhythm. Carts moving somewhere below. A door opening and closing. A specific soundscape of a large building. Doing its ongoing work in the particular, unhurried way of systems that have been running long enough to have found their own efficiency. I knew something the protocol didn't, he said. Protocol was designed to protect against the threats it had already seen. This was a threat it hadn't catalogued yet. Someone had to bridge that gap. He looked at her. It wasn't about being right. It was about a room full of people who didn't know what was in the room with them. Margaret held his gaze for a moment. Something in it settled. I asked Laura to do an internal review of how we structure and compensate the service and support staff across all of our event operations, she said. Not just here, all of them. She said it without performance. Not as a grand gesture, but as the announcement of a grand gesture, as information. Something she had done because the situation had revealed something that needed to be addressed and she was addressing it. The review is ongoing. The changes will be targeted. Affected won't know what prompted it. They don't need to, Jeffrey said. She looked at him once more. The long, honest look of a person who is still revising a calculation, but is getting closer to an answer that holds. Take care of yourself, Mr. Lewis. You too, Miss Wilson. She walked back down the corridor toward the elevator. Jeffrey watched her go for a moment, then he turned back to the bracket. He had confirmed the repair was holding. He logged it, noted the next follow-up check for February. Moved to the next item on the list. The building kept asking for things. He kept providing them. That was the arrangement. It had always been the arrangement. By Tuesday morning in November, 6 weeks after the incident and 2 weeks after the rescheduled event, Jeffrey was on the 3rd floor replacing a section of baseboard trim that had been scuffed during a heavy delivery. The trim work required a specific patience. The adhesive needed to be applied in a thin, even layer. The sectionaling precisely before it set, held in place for minutes with consistent pressure before it could be left. And not rush it. Rushing it meant the section would sit slightly off true, which meant the edge would catch, which meant it would need to be redone. The work was small and exacting and entirely present. He was holding the trim in place. 3 minutes counted in his head when he heard the elevator and footsteps. More than one person. He did not turn to look. The trim needed 3 minutes and the 3 minutes were not up. Legs slowed near him. You're the one from the ballroom. A man's voice, not young, the measured weight of someone who had spent a long time speaking in rooms that required that kind of weight. Jeffrey maintained the pressure on the trim. That depends on which ballroom. October 14th. The Wilson Infrastructure event. Yes. A pause. The footsteps did not resume. Jeffrey completed the 3 minutes, slowly released the pressure. Alignment, level, flush, the edge sitting true. He stood up and turned around. 2 men in their late 60s, both in suits that communicated long professional habit rather than current professional effort. One taller, with the particular spare frame of someone who had always been physically substantial and whose build still communicated it even with the compression of age. Other shorter, with the deliberate stillness of someone who had spent decades in rooms where stillness was the primary currency. Jeffrey recognized neither of them. But during the October investigation, Detective Harris had mentioned that 2 representatives from a federal contractor advisory group had been at the event and had given statements to Nashville PD as witnesses. Not to the intervention itself, but to the event's broader context. They had not sought out Jeffrey at the time. The Holden Group, the taller one said, not an explanation, an identification offered the way people offer names that have been carrying their own weight for long enough that additional context feels redundant. We were at the October event, the shorter man said. We've been in contact with Miss Wilson since, and with Detective Harris's office. Jeffrey waited. Work with federal agencies on security architecture, the taller one said, not operations. Framework design, the systems that operations work within. He paused. The gap that Gary Young exploited, we've been looking at vulnerabilities in systems like it for some time. A specific intervention raised questions for us about where the human judgment component of these frameworks needs to be positioned relative to documentation verification. Not a job offer, the shorter man said. Miss Wilson's people have already made one of those and received an answer, a consultation, the taller one said. A 6-hour observation, the timeline, the behavioral indicators, the specific decision points where the existing protocol failed to capture what you were seeing. We'd like to document it formally, as a case study for framework design. Jeffrey looked at the baseboard trim section. Sitting true, edge flush, 3 minutes of patience producing something that would hold. That would be useful to your work, he said. Whenever suits you. Jeffrey thought about his maintenance calendar. The 4th floor HVAC fitting secondary check was due Thursday. The fitness center equipment had a monthly calibration on Friday. The 3rd floor cart bracket had its follow-up scheduled for next week. Wednesday afternoon, he said. Available from 1 o'clock. The taller man produced a card, only a name and a phone number, no title, no company address. The kind of card that communicated through its absence of information that additional information was available to those who needed it and unnecessary for those who didn't. Jeffrey took it. They stood, Both extended hands, both handshakes were brief and direct. Then they walked back toward the elevator with the unhurried pace of people who had accomplished what they came to accomplish and had other places to be. Jeffrey stood in the corridor for a moment after the elevator closed. Then he put the card in his shirt pocket, picked up his baseboard kit, and checked the alignment of the repair one final time. Not because he doubted it, because checking was part of the work. Completion required confirmation. It held. Wednesday at 1 came. The conversation with the Holden Group took place in a conference room at a law firm downtown that Jeffrey reached by bus, because parking downtown at midday was a particular kind of inefficiency that he had no interest in. Of their people, the woman who led the questions was mid-50s, with the focused quality of someone for whom this kind of material was genuinely interesting rather than professionally necessary, and the session lasted 3 hours and 40 minutes. He described the 6 hours in full. Every position Gary Young had taken, the timing intervals between observations, the pocket check sequence, first at 2:43, each subsequent check documented with time and Gary's position, the specific quality of stillness in the hand during the final window before the intervention, the decision to go to Scott Hill rather than Timothy Clark first, and the reasoning behind it, the decision to go to Timothy Clark and what that conversation had revealed. Oaksel 30 feet, the geometry of the approach, the specific calculation about the shoulder pressure point versus alternative interventions. They recorded it, took notes, asked follow-up questions that demonstrated they understood the operational context well enough to probe its edges. At the end, the woman leading the questions looked at him and said, "You could teach this." Jeffrey looked at the conference room table, the specific surface of a table that had held many important conversations and would hold many more, and did not distinguish between them. "I'm teaching it right now," he said, "just to fewer people." She wrote something down. He took the bus back to the Ashford Grand and clocked in for the afternoon shift. A second-floor east corridor needed restocking. He did it. The fitness center had a light out in the northwest corner. He replaced it. The maintenance log had 3 items flagged for follow-up by end of week. He worked through them in sequence. The building kept asking for things. He kept providing them. November moved toward December. The Ashford Grand put up its holiday decorations on the first weekend of the month, a substantial undertaking that involved the full maintenance team, 2 contracted decorating crews, and a great deal of Laura Clark's precise directorial energy. Jeffrey spent most of Saturday helping position the atrium tree, a 14-foot Fraser fir that arrived on a flatbed from a farm outside of Cookville and required a 3-man lift just to get vertical in the stand without taking out the atrium's lighting installation. It was the kind of work that was entirely physical and entirely present. No pattern analysis required, no geometry of threat vectors. But the immediate, actual fact of a 14-foot tree and the problem of getting it vertical and keeping it there. He found it genuinely satisfying in the way that immediate physical problems were satisfying. They've had solutions that were visible and confirmable within the span of the work itself. The tree went up. Lights went on, 3 hours of stringing because the atrium ceiling was 40 feet, and the lift platform moved at the speed that safety required. The lobby began to look the way the Ashford Grand looked every December. The way a well-maintained building looked when someone who cared about it applied the specific attention that the season required. Jeffrey stood in the lobby at the end of Sunday's shift and looked at the tree. 14 feet. Level. The lights distributed without clusters or gaps because he had done the distribution himself. He clocked out. The Holden Group sent a follow-up document in December, not a job offer but a formal acknowledgement that the consultation had contributed materially to a protocol revision currently being developed for federal event security verification frameworks. The revision was described in general terms. Contribution was described specifically. His name was in it. Jeffrey read the document twice, folded it, put it in the same drawer where he kept the Ashford Grand's maintenance manuals, the HVAC documentation, the elevator maintenance schedule, the lighting system's bulb specification guide. The drawer that held the things the building required him to understand in order to do his work properly. It fit there. He went to make coffee. With it, Christmas week the hotel ran at 92% occupancy, the highest of the year. Laura Clark was everywhere simultaneously, which was her preferred mode during peak periods, distributed across every floor and department in the way of a person who trusted her staff and also needed to confirm personally that the things she trusted were occurring. Ashfree ran a modified maintenance schedule that compressed routine work into smaller windows and expanded his availability for the reactive work that high occupancy periods reliably generated. A toilet mechanism on the 4th floor, a shower valve on the 2nd, a loose railing bracket in the fitness center, different bracket, different floor, same fundamental issue as the 3rd floor cart bracket from earlier in the fall. Placed it the same way, tightened, logged, scheduled a 2-week follow-up verification. Oaks Eve, the lobby was full in the particular way hotel lobbies filled on holidays, families moving through the atrium in the slightly overwhelmed way of people who had been traveling, a group of older guests with the ease of people who had known each other long enough that their silences were comfortable, a young couple at the check-in desk with the specific mixture of exhaustion and anticipation that long travel produced. It was replacing a bulb in the lobby's secondary chandelier, the smaller one on the south side, positioned above the reading alcove, when a girl of about 7 stopped below the ladder and looked up at him. She watched him work for a moment. "What are you doing?" she asked, replacing a light bulb. She considered this. "Is it hard? You have to reach the right spot, and you have to know which bulb fits before you climb up. That part takes practice." She nodded, satisfied with the answer, and went back to her family near the tree. Jeffrey finished the bulb, descended the ladder, tested the fixture. The light came on. He packed up his kit and moved to the next item on the list. The main chandelier had 3 bulbs the system had flagged as approaching end of life. Better to replace them before they burned out than after. That was the principle. Address things before they became problems. You paid attention before the moment of failure rather than in response to it. He had learned that in one context and applied it in another, and had eventually stopped distinguishing between the two. January arrived cold and clear, the Nashville sky doing the particular sharp blue thing it did when the humidity was gone, and the air had a quality of transparency that the summer months never managed. Jeffrey drove to work on the 2nd of January, the first workday of the new year, the hotel quiet in the specific way of the days immediately after a peak period. Occupancy dropping from 92% to 61% overnight as the holiday guests checked out and the building settled back into its ordinary register. He parked in the structure, took the service entrance, made his coffee in the employee kitchen. Maintenance calendar. 4th floor HVAC secondary check overdue by a week due to the holiday schedule. 3rd floor cart bracket 2-week follow-up, no issues at the previous check, schedule the next for February. 2nd floor fitness center mirrors, 1st floor lobby chandelier, 3 bulbs approaching end of life. Address today rather than waiting for the failure. He put his coffee down and picked up his kit. 6 weeks after the incident, Jeffrey had been in the 2nd floor fitness center at 6 in the morning, doing the deep clean that the schedule had pushed twice before it finally landed in its slot. The room had been empty at that hour, the way it always was at 6 before the early guests arrived around 6:30. They had moved through the room methodically. Equipment surfaces, mirror sections, the floor around the free weights where chalk and grip residue accumulated faster than the daily wipe-down addressed. He had been halfway through the mirror section when he stopped. Not for any external reason. The room was quiet. Nothing had changed. Stopped because something had surfaced, the way things surfaced in quiet rooms when you stopped moving long enough to notice them. He had stood at the mirror and thought about Cincinnati. Not the corridor, not the specific sequence of events. The decision he had made the morning after, the resignation, the drive south, the choice to set down the thing he had been carrying and find something that fit differently. He had made that choice because of a failure of judgment, because he had overridden his own read of a situation in deference to a hierarchy that turned out to have a gap, and someone had fallen through the gap, and he had decided the cost of operating in that system at that level of stakes was more than he was willing to continue paying. And 6 weeks before that morning, in a ballroom in Nashville, he had encountered the same structure, the same gap between verified documentation and actual behavior, the same hierarchy that was not built to process what he was seeing, the same stakes, and this time he had not deferred. Not because he was more certain than he had been in Cincinnati. Certainty was not the variable. The variable was the source of the certainty. In Cincinnati, his certainty had come from the system's training, from the framework, from the team lead's confidence that he had absorbed rather than interrogated. In Nashville, his certainty had come from 6 hours of his own patient observation, 5 documented positions with timestamps, 6 pocket checks with documented intervals, a geometry so specific it could only describe one thing. He had trusted his own judgment. Judgment he had spent 2 years rebuilding, one maintenance log entry at a time, in a building that did not care about his past and only needed him to show up and pay attention. At the mirror, he had not felt vindicated. He had not felt resolved. He had felt, for the first time in 3 years, located, like a level that had been reading slightly off true and had finally been corrected. He went back to the mirror cleaning. The surface came clean in slow, even strokes. Now in January, he went upstairs and started the day's work. The 4th floor HVAC fitting was holding. He logged the secondary check. Clean, no issues, next scheduled verification in 6 months. The 3rd floor cart bracket follow-up confirmed no loosening since the repair. Brightness center mirrors needed the northwest corner addressed, which he had noted last time and was noting again now, which meant the cleaning protocol for that corner needed adjustment rather than simply repeated effort. He logged a recommendation. The problem would be addressed structurally, not just responded to repeatedly. That was how maintenance worked when it was done correctly. You didn't just fix things. You understood why they broke and adjusted the conditions so they broke less often. The work was never just the task in front of you. It was the pattern the task was part of. He had understood that about hotel maintenance. He was beginning to understand, always understood it about everything else too. Lobby chandelier took 40 minutes, 3 bulbs, each requiring the lift platform to be repositioned, each requiring the fixture to be partially disassembled and reassembled. He did it with the patience the work required. When he was finished, all 3 sockets had fresh bulbs, the fixture was reassembled correctly, and the light it produced was even and complete. He descended the platform. In the lobby for a moment, looking up at the chandelier, even, complete. The way a thing looked when it had been attended to properly. He clocked out at 7:43. Drove home through Nashville in the early winter dark, the city doing its January things, quieter than December, running at a lower frequency, the sound of a place that had finished something and had not yet begun the next thing. Lights on the bridge over the Cumberland ran in their long chain above the water. The specific quality of a city at 7:40 in January, when the day had already given most of what it had, and the people inside it were moving toward wherever they rested. He ate dinner, read for an hour, not because the reading connected to anything or built toward anything, just because the thing he was reading was worth reading and the evening had space for it. He was in bed before 10. The alarm was set for 5. The Ashford Grand would need the same attention tomorrow that it had needed today and the day before that, and every day he had worked in it for 2 years. It would not acknowledge this, not thank him for it. It would simply stand, as large buildings stand, receiving whatever was given to it and requiring more. He had built his life around providing that attention, not in the absence of alternatives. The Holden Group consultation had continued into a 2nd and 3rd session, and the formal documentation they had produced carried his name in a federal framework revision that would outlast the specific incident that prompted it. Stephanie Harris had called once more, informally, to tell him the case against Gary Young had proceeded to arraignment without complications. Lacey Clark had sent a brief professional email in November saying he was available if Jeffrey ever wanted to talk, and Jeffrey had not yet responded, but would, eventually, when it felt like the right time. These were threads that continued. He held them without pulling on them. What was not a thread, but a foundation, was the maintenance calendar. The brass fixtures and the light bulbs, and the cart brackets and the HVAC fittings and the baseboard trim and the fitness center mirrors and the atrium tree and the lobby chandelier. The building's ongoing requirement for attention from someone willing to provide it consistently, without sentiment, without expecting acknowledgement. People he passed in the Ashford Grand's corridors met his eyes now in a way they had not before October, not with the careful awareness of people who had been caught underestimating someone, not with the performance of compensatory respect, but with the ordinary directness of people who saw him. Simply that, the front desk staff, the catering team. Scott Hill when their paths crossed in the second-floor service area. Laura Clark in the way she had always looked at him, except now with less of the question behind it. He had not needed that before. He did not need it now. The work had always been real regardless of whether anyone registered it as such. But there was a quality to being seen accurately that was different from being unseen. Not better in any hierarchical sense, just more correct. A building's systems ran more efficiently when the maintenance log reflected their actual condition rather than an approximation of it. The Ashford Grand had always been his room. Now it felt like the people in it understood that. He found he did not mind. He closed his eyes. Outside the window, Nashville was quiet, in the way January made it quiet, not silent, just running, at the frequency of a city that had settled into the long stretch of ordinary time between the compressed energy of the holidays and whatever came next. The Cumberland was out there somewhere, doing what rivers did, indifferent and continuous. The building needed him in the morning. That was enough. That had always been enough. He slept.